Okay, logic. I haven't done any logic videos, but we're going to try one today to explain some things about the common topic of relationship. And some of your chapters, really starting on chapter 15 and running through a lot of the rest of the chapter, or through a lot of the rest of the book, are really about this idea of relationship. And so we want to do some work with that today. How are two statements related, or how do we relate statements to show certain truths about certain things? Now, your book talks about several layers of this. One of them is the idea of cause and effect. One of the relationship issues is the idea of cause and effect. And when we talk about cause and effect, one of the things we need to be pretty aware of is the fact that sometimes there is more than one kind of cause. Some causes are what we would call necessary causes. In other words, the effect will only happen if this necessary cause exists. In other words, if I don't have muscles, I can't bench press 300 pounds. That would be a necessary cause. Without that situation, I would not be able to bench press 300 pounds. Obviously, I can't. On the other hand, you do have what are called sufficient causes. In other words, it's something that exists that may help that effect happen. If I work out every day, or if I take steroids, I will be able to bench press 300 pounds. Now, the important thing to notice here is that may be a sufficient cause to cause something to happen. It's not necessarily a necessary cause. It's not necessarily the thing that actually makes it happen. Now, this becomes important because as you go through life and you make a number of statements and try to arguments about things, and you say that something causes something, you do have to understand that sometimes it doesn't actually, it's not the necessary cause, it's just a sufficient cause, and that other things may have the same effect. Now, that sort of leads into the next thing that we want to spend a little bit of time on, and that is this situation that we call antecedent and consequence. From your math, from your science, from other issues, and even from our first semester logic, you may remember that we have this idea of antecedent. If a situation exists, there is a consequence. Sometimes in logic, these are abbreviated as P and Q. And there's really four relationships because you have two parts of this. There's four possible relationships, and those relationships can go into a set of statements or an argument that may or may not be true. We've dealt with this in introductory logic earlier in the year. But we also want to be able to see how those work into a basic argument. So for example, we have what is called in Latin modus ponens. And modus ponens is really when you say, if you have an antecedent and a consequence, and you affirm the antecedent. If I study, I will get good grades. If I study, I will get good grades. I study. Therefore, I will get good grades. Now, that is actually a valid statement. If the first statement is true and the second statement is true, then the conclusion is true. We call that modus ponens. And that's a valid use of that relationship of cause and effect. Another valid way to look at this is what we call modus tollens. And in other words, if we deny the consequence, that may be a valid statement. So if I study, then I will get good grades. But I don't study. I'm sorry, but I don't get good grades. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I deny the consequence, not the antecedent. Therefore, that means I didn't study. Again, that's a valid statement. That would be true if not Q or not the consequence, and that means the antecedent must not have been there. Now, we got to be careful because just anytime you put two things together in an if-then statement, it's not necessarily a valid statement. So if we say if P then Q, and Q exists, therefore P, that's not necessarily so. Affirming the consequent is not necessarily a valid relationship. So if P then Q, in other words, if I study, I will get good grades. I get good grades. I can't necessarily affirm that I study. There's many reasons why people get good grades. Some of them are wonderful, some of them not so much. There are different reasons why you or I may do well on a test that have nothing to do with me studying. That's an invalid situation. The second invalid relationship of cause and of if and then is denying the antecedent. If I study, I will get good grades, but I didn't study. Therefore, not Q. This is kind of the opposite side of affirming the consequent. Just because I don't study doesn't mean I will necessarily not get good grades. And so when I look at antecedents and consequences, I have to understand that I got to put these into a valid arrangement, and I can only draw valid consequences. Again, we studied that in the first semester, and so that's not really a new thing. Another thing that we studied that gets touched on in this section is the idea of contraries or contrarieties and contradictions. I'm guessing that to the average ear and probably even to mine, those sound like the same thing. But logically speaking, there's a slight difference. Relationship speaking, there's a slight difference. And if we could go back and think about our square of opposition in the first semester, we'll remember that there's a little different relationship between A statements and E statements, all statements and no statements, and as opposed to what we would call contradictory statements, A statements and O statements, for example, all and some are not statements. In the case of contrary statements, or what your book calls contrariety, what you're really doing is just denying something. You're just saying this is not true. If you go to contradictory, you're actually saying the opposite. You're actually saying the opposite. So, for example, and I will just I guess, get a head start really on the assignment that you have on page 124, I believe. It says, war is the cause of all misery in the world. It's kind of an A statement in a sense. Well, you could contrary that and just say war is not the cause of all misery in the world. Or you could go even farther and say no misery is caused by war. There's a difference between saying there's some misery that's not caused by war and some that is, and saying the contradictory statement that war doesn't cause misery at all. So as you make statements, it's important to be sure to be precise when you make contradictory statements as opposed to contrary statements. And you'll get a little exercise with that with your assignments. The last thing I want to touch on real quickly here is the idea of some fallacies that come with relationship. And your book talks about 3, and I'm going to focus on 2. One is the idea of just simply the false cause. And we see this with both of what we've just talked about, is you have to be kind of careful, because sometimes we say that something is a cause just because 2 things tend to happen at the same time. Or we just see 2 things that are related in some way, and we assume that one caused the other, or one always causes the other, or the one is a necessary cause as opposed to a sufficient cause. Let's be careful with that. The second part of this is the second one, and it's very close, is the idea of the post hoc statement or argument. And that says that just because something happened before something, just because something happens before another situation, that first one caused the other. And of course, this is a very common fallacy in life, and it's related. We talked about it before. It's related to this idea of relationship. And so, as we think about it, and as you do your assignments for this week, hopefully, if you're having a little bit of confusion, some of what we've talked about just now may clear some of that up. We'll talk to you tomorrow, and hopefully you'll have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and we will, again, look forward to the next time.